Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. Soviet resorts were supposed to represent the good life under socialism. Health, rest, sea air, mineral water, sanatoriums, and the state's promise that ordinary citizens had a right to rest. Scholars of Soviet leisure note that health resorts were an important part of Soviet planning from the early years of the regime, with dozens of state resorts already in operation by the early 1920s, and that post-war domestic tourism expanded into a major social project. By the late Soviet era, places like Sochi and Yalta had become symbols of official leisure, packed with sanatoriums, holiday homes, and giant hotels. But that same environment created perfect conditions for crime. Resort towns concentrated strangers, cash, scarcity, temporary relationships, and people moving in and out quickly. In places designed for relaxation, oversight was often more complicated than it looked. Visitors arrived for short stays, private secrets were easier to keep, and people who met in a resort might never see each other again. In practical terms, that meant petty crime, fraud, black market dealing, sexual exploitation, and violent incidents could all hide behind holiday normality. The record for Soviet resort towns is strongest on these patterns rather than on one single famous murder case. And that itself is revealing. Much of the crime in resort zones was diffuse, local, and easier to bury behind the noise of leisure. Sochi is the clearest example. A scholarly study of Soviet press culture describes it as a popular holiday resort that gathered millions of visitors from all over the Soviet Union every year. That scale matters. A town receiving visitors on that level was not just a beach destination. It was a huge temporary city layered on top of an existing one. It brought together tourists, local workers, seasonal staff, transport workers, youth groups, and people simply looking for opportunity. Even the Komsomol militia's aggressive attempts to police visitor behavior in Sochi show that the authorities understood these resort crowds were difficult to manage. A place filled with millions of short-term visitors is also a place where theft, deception, and hidden misconduct become much harder to track cleanly. What made resort towns especially vulnerable was anonymity. In an ordinary neighborhood, strangers stand out. In a resort, strangers are the point. People arrive with luggage, cash, and the expectation of a temporary break from routine. That lowers suspicion. It also makes reporting harder. A wallet stolen on a beach, a fake guide, a room scam, a black market deal, or a sudden disappearance can be dismissed as an isolated holiday mishap unless someone takes the wider pattern seriously. Soviet leisure studies emphasize that tourism and rest homes created special social environments, places where ordinary rules loosened and informal behaviors flourished. Once everyday social control weakens, crime finds room to grow. Resort towns also became natural spaces for the Soviet shadow economy. One JSTOR study of tourism and security in Soviet Estonia notes that Intourist, the official organization handling foreign visitors, faced competition from a growing number of speculators, which weakened its monopoly over hard currency. That is a crucial clue. Tourist zones, especially those exposed to foreigners or consumer demand, created openings for illegal exchange. Hard currency, scarce goods, unofficial guides, resale schemes, and side deals all flowed more easily where visitors had money and wanted things the official system could not supply. In other words, the resort economy and the shadow economy naturally overlapped. And once that overlap appears, criminal opportunity widens. A classic study of the Soviet black market notes that prostitution existed as an illegal commodity, even though the system formally refused to acknowledge it openly. The same black market logic applied to currency exchange, speculation, under-the-counter sales, and access to scarce services. Resort towns magnified those incentives. A visitor arriving for 10 days with spending money, privacy, and no long-term ties to the local community created exactly the sort of market in which unofficial services could flourish. That did not mean every resort became a crime zone in the same way. It meant resorts were unusually well suited to crimes based on secrecy, cash, and temporary relationships. The darker side of Soviet resort towns was not limited to street-level crime. It also reached into corruption. A 1983 UPI report on Soviet politics described corruption centered on Krasnodar's Black Sea spas, especially Sochi, as serious enough to be associated with the fall of senior party boss Sergei Medunov, a figure linked to Brezhnev's patronage network. That matters because it shows resort town criminality was not just about pickpockets, scams, or vice. It could run upward into administrative protection, distribution of favors, and the manipulation of resort resources for private gain. A town built around access to rooms, treatments, supplies, or coveted vacation spots also created opportunities for officials to sell that access informally. This is where the private secrets part of the story becomes especially important. Soviet leisure scholars have pointed out that resort and rest home culture was deeply tied to intimate behavior, temporary romances, and a level of personal experimentation that did not fit the public image of Soviet morality. One study bluntly notes that despite the famous cliché that there is no sex in the Soviet Union, behavior in Soviet health resorts and rest homes should not be ignored. Another points to tourism and travel as spaces associated with sexual initiation and social freedom. That does not make resorts automatically criminal, but it does explain why resorts could become settings for blackmail, deception, hidden relationships, and violence that was later hard to reconstruct. When people meet far from home, under false names, or inside relationships they never intend to discuss publicly, the truth becomes easier to lose. The Soviet state understood parts of this problem, but not always in a transparent way. Rather than fully admitting how leisure spaces could generate crime, disorder, and unofficial economies, the authorities often responded through moral campaigns, surveillance, youth policing, and selective crackdowns. The pressure on appearance mattered. A resort was supposed to display socialist well-being, not expose its underside. That made scandal itself a threat. When officials are more concerned with preserving a place's public image than openly describing its problems, crime becomes easier to push sideways rather than confront directly. What looks like a clean, healthy resort on the surface may be held together by silence underneath. This helps explain why Soviet resort towns could feel deceptively safe. They were full of uniforms, hotels, sanatoriums, official excursion systems, and state planning. They looked organized. But organization is not the same as protection. A resort crowd gives thieves cover. A temporary affair gives deceivers cover. A hard currency market gives speculators cover. A corrupt local network gives offenders cover. And a state anxious about embarrassment gives all of them one more advantage: delay. By the time the public sees the darker pattern, the people involved may already be gone, back on a train to another city, or protected by the fact that the holiday season itself has washed everything forward. That is why the dark history of crime in Soviet resort towns matters. Resorts promised health and rest, but they also concentrated exactly the conditions that let crime hide well: strangers, movement, leisure, private rooms, loose morals by official standards, scarce goods, and money looking for shortcuts. The most securely documented record is not a single famous chain of murders in one resort. It is the broader pattern. In places built for relaxation, criminal opportunity flourished behind appearances. Theft could look like confusion. Fraud could look like hospitality. Vice could look like leisure. Corruption could look like local privilege. And violence, when it appeared, was easier to bury inside a temporary world where few people knew the full story. In the end, Soviet resort towns were not dark because every beach, spa, or sanatorium hid a notorious killer. They were dark because leisure itself created cover. The resort was a place where people arrived to disappear for a while from ordinary life. That made it perfect for rest. It also made it perfect for secrets. And in the Soviet Union, where the state was already built around selective truth, that combination could make crime especially hard to see clearly until after the fact. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.